imagine I am a CTO or a CIO of a company. What would you recommend in terms of decisions I now have to take regarding bringing forward my voice initiative in my company? Oh, you muted.
Depends on what industry you're in, but I'll take it as a general prospect. So the first thing that I would suggest is you do want to create an assistant, but one of the things that I just put out last week is I'm trying to get people to develop some finer definitions around what voice is, because between Siri and Alexa, and then later maybe Google Assistant, but between those, they set the stage where everyone thinks voice now is an assistant. And it's often misapplied because, as Monica mentioned, most of what's being used, in fact, if you look at 9 of the top 10 use cases on smart speakers, they are single shot. They're not multi-turn interactions. And so it's actually using voice much more like a command and control or a user interface. Just a point and click user interface. You're just using basically a voice mouse in this case. And so the first thing I tell them is say, okay, depending on what your objectives are, you really need to think about your strategy. And there's 3 categories of things you might want to use. You might want to use a voice interface, and you might want to use a voice assistant, or you might want to use an agent, voice agent. And so the voice interface really does allow you to do that command and control, this single shot. You ask for something, it comes back, very dependent on a services model. It's deterministic in the way you program it. Then you move into the voice assistant where you're handling more complex things. And that might be very important for you to be able to service a customer, gather more information, provide more complex services, and also maybe tap into dynamic services on the back end that can fulfill the need better. And then the third is an agent, which would actually do things proactively for a user. Now, that's not going to be appropriate for all CTOs, but for some organizations, being able to have this assistant that can work on your behalf when you're not there, either analyzing or actually committing actions on your behalf, is the height of convenience, right? So one of the things that I think we probably all agree on in this panel is that the trend toward computing over the last 2 decades has been towards convenience. And voice has a tremendous ability to do that. But sometimes what I would just say is that CTOs are, based on the existing paradigm and the way the vendors talk about things, they say, oh, well, let's just put an assistant in, when that might be over-engineering the solution or under-engineering the solution. And then in terms of interoperability, and I'll close on this point, that's the one thing I will comment is that most organizations initially for what they're trying to accomplish are not incentivized for interoperability. It's extra effort, and they generally have very narrow objectives in mind, and they can serve those much better by not adding all of this complexity. Plus, you know, as I wrote in Harvard Business Review 4 years ago, really their incentives are to control that front door and not to take their customers off to somebody else who might then snag them away, and they wouldn't be able to maintain that attention or authority that they want to have. And so, but that's okay. I think people need to understand that up front, to say that, okay, sometimes they're going to have these sort of closed off systems, but ultimately, particularly if you're a specialty player, but this is true for everybody, general purpose as well, there's going to be other services that you want to access. And many of those other services will be accessible most effectively through potentially other assistants. And so longer term, it's a much better solution for you to have that interoperability option, even if your initial implementation is much more of a siloed model.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead, Monica.
You know, that reminds me of the AOL days, right? At the beginning of the web, you're saying, okay, here is, here, you just have to come to us and we'll make sure that we give you all the connections and these are all secure and recommended and so forth. And we rejected that, right? I mean, because voice, you know, because the web is too big for that. Everybody wants to participate. They don't want to be controlled by some single player. And a voice is even bigger in that sense because it reaches everybody and not just the people who are tech savvy. Okay. And I think, I really believe it is too big to be controlled by a single party. And so instead of a picture where I will have many, many assistants listening to me. You know, every assistant is waiting for a wake word, and they're listening in on what we are saying, okay? And so what you really like to have is a neutral player at the bottom, and then you can get access all kinds of different services, different agents, and different assistants and different skills, just like what we are doing on a browser, where we can go and visit every single web page.
So Monica, I'd like just to follow up on that, because I think we did reject the AOL model until it was the Apple App Store, right? And so mobile gives us that opposite view of where people were okay with not having interoperability and only having two choices. With that said, I'll just go back to this other thing, because this will be controversial enough, and that there's this ongoing debate about one voice assistant to rule them all, or multiple voice assistants more in an app model. What we're seeing right now is more the app model of voice assistants, and Misha sort of started to talk about this, is that the consumers, even though it is hard for them to understand what the boundary conditions are for what different assistants can do, they tend to figure it out. And we see this, that a lot of people are using a different voice assistant in their car versus their home versus their phone, because they're developing habits separately in these different contexts. And so whether it's good or bad for people, because I think everyone likes this idea of having the Uber assistant, although I'd say that from a privacy and security standpoint, that might not be obvious. Federated models tend to segment your information and maybe increase privacy, reduce attack surface for bad actors. But right now, what I think of is that we have no problem using 9 apps on a daily basis, 30 apps on a monthly basis, and having 130 apps on our phone, and understanding what each can do. And it strikes me that actually the assistants that are coming up are able to do that. And in fact, most of the time, the assistant is not an assistant first, it's a feature first of something else. And so in that case, then we have to look beyond the general purpose assistant to all these other places where we have these specialist assistants. And that for the most part, I think where consumers are actually migrating, and maybe it's just because that's the only option they have, but where they're migrating is not the one assistant, but the multiple assistants as apps.
So what I'm hearing here is that let's say the voice domain is sort of an infinite game, right? Because there's no one assistant to rule them all. I mean, if that has been the case, then Siri would have been the most used voice assistant right now, which we all know it's not the case. So I think where we are going towards is more this, there are a few general purpose assistants which are trying to be good at a lot of things. And, would that end up in 3 of them, a duopoly or a monopoly or a period of years? It's something that we need to see. But at the same time, like Miha pointed out, there is space for the narrow ones, which are good at doing few things, but does that better, well, which is what the Magenta voice assistant does, right? I mean, if you're a telecom customer, then we make sure that all the telecom things are best served by our assistant. And for us, we also need to then bring it to places where customers are, which should mean sometimes, own touch points, but also sometimes third-party touch points. And this is where, let's say, the interoperability questions start playing up. I mean, some of them are very closed shops, so you cannot get there, but others are completely open. But then adding the complexity on top is, of course, the customer experience. Do people want to now remember multiple wake words, right? Or there is a bit of cognitive overload if you think of to remember which assistant should I talk to what, which is why I really like the approach or the idea of, I think, what Monica, you are proposing with some kind of an open registry. I think there's also work going on in OBN around that, where there is this, whatever we call it, there's some layer that makes sure that discoverability and ease of use or ease of access is there, and that we don't transfer that cognitive overload to the consumers.
I want to, so I agree with what you're saying, Reghu, and I actually want to go back to what Bret said about the number of apps that we have that we use on a daily basis or a monthly basis. What I want to know is how many web pages do the world access in a day? Okay, the part of the reason is that with the phone, we're still relying on the web for a lot of connections to many, many different sources of information and services. But when it comes to voice, how do I get to all these other services? Does it mean that I'm going to now go back to the phone and use a display? Okay, I think that the question is whether you think of it as an addition to what we are already doing, or it is going to be a main user interface, which I believe truly is the right thing, because this is what the technology is about. We already have the technology to make that happen. And I think there is another difference between what you are talking about and what I'm talking about, is that obviously I'm a professor and I want to change the world. I don't want to stick with the status quo. I mean, this is where we are today, but that's not what we want to do, as well, I think. If you think that voice is very important today, it is just the beginning. Okay, voice is going to grow even much bigger as the technology gets better. And before long, we would just say, if you look at this, these GUI displays, we would get to a point where it's like, what is that about? It is so much easier if I use voice. So this is how I think that the future has to change, because this technology is that pervasive. I mean, that much more easy and natural than than the GUIs that we have been using all these years.